Hello guys, welcome to the first interview of the Leap Takers podcast, where I'm interviewing fascinating people from various areas which all have one thing in common. They took a risk and tried something novel and unique. This can be in areas such as business, sustainable technologies, investing, traveling, sports, or even gaming. So my first guest today is Daniel Naeff. He is a very smart guy, very nice guy as well, that I was lucky enough to meet a couple of months ago. So who is Daniel? After finishing his engineering studies at the ETH in Zurich and MIT in Boston, he worked for several startups. The most famous probably Teralytics, where he was the VP of operations. And most recently, with his newest venture called Oakura, he tries nothing less than to disrupt the traditional venture capital space. I'm very excited that he could come on the show. We have some very interesting topics that we cover, including Daniel's learnings from being a founder, how to use Essentialist thinking to make better life decisions, tips on hiring and assembling the best team, as well as Daniel's favorite books and unique hobbies. So please enjoy this premiere episode of the Leap Takers podcast with Daniel Naeff. Okay, welcome Daniel. Welcome to the Leap Takers podcast, episode number 1. So I first thought we could start with your fascination about entrepreneurship and how you got into it. Since you started several companies, or you were involved in several companies. So maybe walk me through how you got into entrepreneurship and why you like that route that you took so far.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for being here, Remo. So I think what always fascinated me was that from an idea or from at the end, ideas or possibilities that you only could imagine that are in your brain, that you could, as long as you can fascinate others and bring them together, turn an idea into something that is much more tangible and eventually a product, a company, something that has much more impact on everyone that is involved. And I think I consider myself to have started rather late with an entrepreneurial way, because until I finished my bachelor's at ETH in mechanical engineering, I wasn't even too much involved and didn't have much insight in this entire entrepreneurial way of thinking. But it basically started with joining ETH Juniors, a student consulting company at ETH that is a group of very driven individuals wanting to improve themselves, wanting to do more than just more boring studies at ETH. And that got me very fascinated in as well the abilities and the possibilities, the ideas of taking something with ETH Juniors is basically selling projects to companies, but as a student that is typically far beyond what you imagine that you don't think you can just talk and pitch to a group of executives from a larger company and get them convinced that they should pay you some money for then what we would do, search for students that would actually do the work. So we would do kind of a project work. But that kind of got me drawn into that route of realizing how much more interesting it can be, something more self-determined than just joining a larger company and working a 9-to-5 job. When I went to write my master thesis in the US, I got very drawn into what the US obviously is. Many people there, they want to do and start something by themselves. And before I went to the US, when I was talking to people and friends, and if I would say, I think I want to start something myself, it was, back then it was still not as popular as now. I think now everyone talks as well about entrepreneurship.
Yeah, right.
But back then it was more like, okay, weird, are you sure, why? But when I went to the US and I shared the same intent, everyone was looking at me like, yeah, I mean, of course, everyone does. And I think I got tossed into that ecosystem in Boston, is particularly as well being one of the hotspots as well for startups and innovation ecosystem at the big universities. Mm-hmm. And I was I joined or I was part of the opening of the Harvard Innovation Lab. Half Harvard students and half MIT students were able to apply and to join. So I got in from the MIT side. And it was an extended weekend just thinking of ideas, trying to iterate very quickly, kind of I think it was as well the very early days of these startup weekends or startup weeks, that I got into a small group and we tossed a few interesting ideas around, and it was for me very, it got much more realistic to see and realize that actually ideas and fascinations could be turned much faster into something more tangible, or at least trying. Because obviously the many people that I met there, they either have worked already on several things, they have failed on several things and iterated, and some of them got further. But when I came back afterwards, coincidentally bumped into contact that I had back from ETH Juniors times, that a colleague we worked with as a partner with ETH Juniors. I got interested in a case that I think they just won a startup.ch award, got 50,000 as a grant, and started with a what I thought was the product not really something I was excited about, but rather like the concept of mass customizing footwear. And I think in retrospect it was interesting because I didn't really share any passion for the product, and that probably was as well not an optimal decision, because by now I would obviously say, well, if you don't share a passion for the product, don't do it. But I got into that and into that business and joined, but was then in a I think some, how could I say this? I made some very interesting learnings to realize what it means if a team constellation is maybe not as adaptive, or if the iterations and the speed at which you try to understand what does the market really want and what did you initially think you want to do, iterating that faster. Okay. So really taking the concept of a lean startup much more serious in order to iterate fast.
Yeah, maybe just to quickly interrupt. Sorry. So just to summarize, I think you went to the US, and what I understand, this had a big impact on you then once you came back to Switzerland to join or to start this company, right? And so in the US, was that during your master's studies, or how can I order this in your timeline, and how long were you there, and where exactly in the US, just to go back?
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. And thanks. So I went for 1 year in 2011.
Okay.
I think summer 11, I went over to write my master's thesis as the kind of final part of my master's at ETH in Management, Technology and Economics. Initially, the plan was to just be there for half a year to write the thesis and then come back. But the professor I was with, Olivier Devec, fascinating, super driven professor that he himself did his PhD at ETH. He was including me in very interesting additional initiatives that he was as well involved. So in one particular one, where it's an additional commission that where I was included and able to contribute. And because of that, the entire stay got extended. So eventually I was for 1 year in Boston, or Cambridge at MIT to be more specific. And then afterwards came back.
Okay. Very interesting. And do you think for someone that wants to take the same path, because in my own experience as well, I think it's very helpful to have these experiences, very formative experiences abroad, be it as an exchange semester or writing a paper or a master thesis or something similar abroad. Are there any specific tips that you would give to people that would like to try something themselves, if you can come up with something right now?
Yeah.
Or any recommendations for people who would like to pursue something similar?
I think, for everyone it's probably different. But if I reflect back on it, I think it's, on one hand, it's the kind of the continuous curiosity that I always had as well with traveling, and what you mentioned as well, studying abroad. So maybe as a background, interesting to know is that I grew up in Ivory Coast until I was 5, so West Africa. So completely different environment. And as well, during my studies, I was always very interested to try to not to just do one thing, but so I went as well to Singapore for a semester. It was very interesting as well. It gave me a different perspective. And then as well the US. But I think for everyone that feels like adventurous enough, I think definitely to go abroad and collect as many different inputs and ideas, because I think the more you see, the more you realize what you like, what you are maybe less interested in, and the more you can even almost kind of iterate on your own interests to find something that you really feel passionate about and interested to spend your time with.
Okay. And so you came back to Switzerland and you joined Diamond Heels, the company.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you mentioned that you did not have a big passion for the product, but you still pursued it. So maybe continue where I stopped you before. So you said there were some learnings involved in that. And what would you do different maybe nowadays? And maybe also quickly tell me more about the product or what you were building with Diamond Heels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so at the core is basically, or how it started is, the way the founders pitched it as well, won this competition, was by introducing a simple means of creating your own shoe. Basically, as a woman, if you want to create a high heel, you can choose all sorts of different aspects of it. And through web interface, you basically can click different pieces together. But also in a physical, as part of a physical box, where you have all these different components in it, you can actually have a much more tangible feeling of what's gonna be if you look at these different items, whether it's like different types of leathers, whether it's different forms of shoes, whether it's like different sizes and width of heels and so on. So a combination of a much more tangible feeling on how you could put the pieces together, but then as well through an interface, just clicking and deciding on how would the shoe eventually look like, and then pressing a button, and then an order being sent to the production facility that actually would then produce. On one hand, we had, to your other question, maybe as well the setup. We had interesting manufacturers as well that produced for Armani's and so on. So high-end production sites. But we realized as well the reluctance that they were in terms of trying something new that obviously would create much higher cost for them, because it's not just a mass production. So in summary, I think what I was particularly interested in is the mass customization that goes along with such a business idea, of figuring out how can you produce something almost at mass, but individual. And so from my mechanical engineering background, obviously there were some interesting aspects of it. But I think in hindsight, the challenge, and I think the learnings that I took with me is that joining a team or a case that is already there with certain dynamics and certain entanglements and so on is almost like if you sit down on a chessboard where someone has already moved a few items, that might have the player might have already won or lost a few of the pawns, but at the end you don't really start. You cannot set it up in a way that you might have done if you would have started. So I think that is the interesting aspect that I think as well, or looking back, a way to think of whenever you start maybe something new, how much can you still form, or how much can you not form? And I think that was for me a very interesting learning. But before we got it's like a licensing system. That's how do you say in English, and Lizenzsystem, it's licensing system. And I think we lined up about 20 different licensees in different cities as well in Switzerland. But at that point, when I was interacting and met with Luciano and Georg, the founders of Teralytics, they had just like closed the initial round, and then round, and one thing led to the other, and we realized why not joining together, because I've worked with them as well during my ETH Juniors time, and that was the almost inevitable next step, because it was very difficult to decline their offer and joining them in their early startup.
Okay. So that was kind of the
next step.
Decision point where you kind of switched from Diamond Heels then over to Teralytics. Mm-hmm. So Teralytics, what did you know about it when you decided to jump in there? Like, now it's known as this analytics company that tracks flow of people and draws certain conclusions from that for cities, etc. But was it always the same concept right from the beginning, or did that evolve over time? Or how did they, maybe better question, how did they pitch it to you to join their startup?
I mean, I already was, even before, or at the very early stage, when Georg as well, and Donald Kosman, when they, and Luciano, when they at the very early stage were working on it, was already involved in some sort of like, I remember Georg, I think, pitched at one point before he went to one of the venture kick events. So I was already involved and kind of had an idea from an early stage. So at the moment where we met again in exchange and realized that we could as well, that I could join them, it was not too much of a question like, oh, so what are you exactly doing? Mm-hmm. So it was already clear that there will be some kind of way to get from larger corporations that have big data sets, as for example, telecommunications companies, to get access to that data, polish it, bring it to, analyze it, and bring it to into a form that for an additional party would generate some business insights. And so there were obviously different kind of aspects of it that would slightly change or be amended, or different industries being looked at. But at its very essence, it already was that.
Okay. And what was your role at Teralytics?
So basically anything that that was not on Georg or Luciano's table, so to say. So all operations aspects of it was very interesting to me as well, because I haven't had before the possibility to really deal with all these different things that are necessary in a company that is growing and was growing that rapidly.
And was Teralytics a bootstrap startup, or did you get funding, external funding from VCs or angel investors very early on?
Yeah, the latter.
The latter, okay. And so maybe just, do you have any insights from that for other aspiring founders? Do you rather recommend to get funding right away, or to first try to bootstrap it yourself? Do you have any, if you can tell?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is not even related to Teralytics, but I think this is more like what I now spend more time with, and understanding like what works and what does not work in the venture industry. To what extent is venture capital broken? As I think a famous report from the Kaufman Foundation, some, I don't know, 5 years back, was published. I think the question, if I would recommend that or not, I think it really depends on the business and as well what the founders want to do. If you get money from a VC, there are like some opportunities, because if you are the one promising star and potential outlier in their portfolio, and if they are convinced that you're that, then you can experience a tremendous boost, and that is obviously kind of the hyper growth route that you then possibly can take. But as we all know, not all portfolio companies in a venture portfolio are outliers, if there's any at all. And if you're not one of those high promising ones, then the limited resources of these funds are often not enough to help you and extend and provide you that support that your company might need to be successful. But as well, the word successful is already very difficult, because it's successful that you have to be able to return a 10x in 5 or 10 years, or is as well successful if you can build a company that generates sustainable revenue within a short amount of time. So I think to boil it down to your question, I think it really depends what route you want to take. But in any case, if you can bootstrap, I think it's always better. Obviously, if you bootstrap and someone else that does the same gets venture money, they might be stronger in terms of outcompeting you, because you might not have the time to just build your company slowly. So it really depends on the context, but I think at the end it's important to not to just look at the selling price, but the fine print. And it means not necessarily the valuation or the money you possibly can acquire by joining a VC, but rather what is really in, how much operational or hands-on support do you get? How strong is that network of the VC? And because important to know is most VCs are not profitable. It's an industry where you wonder how is it possible that so much money flows in? But I could continue on these topics, obviously. But it's not the VC's problem caused necessarily. But I think it's the setup and the structure and the misaligned incentives that are just in place as of today. So I think if I would build something where I have the chance to just bootstrap, I think bootstrapping is always nicer. Or taking investments from individuals or corporations that are in for the long term, that are interested to build something in a sustainable way rather than like tossing money quickly and then take it out fast.
Yeah. I also think as a founder, you really need to think about what is your motivation and your main reason why you're doing this. Why are you building this company? Because this differs for everyone. And some people, they want to grow quickly, and for that, a VC is definitely helpful. And then maybe you have a big exit later and you make some nice money. But for others, maybe that's not the main motivation. And then it might be helpful to grow at your own speed in your own terms, and then also build something that you have full control over. I think that's also something that people should be aware of when they think about different funding options. You already started touching some of the points I wanted to talk with you about later regarding the misalignment of interests in VC, or that the VC model could potentially be broken. And I think that's where your newest venture is. In this area, you position yourself with your newest venture, Oakura. And it might be the right time to bring this up. So after Teralytics, I think you spent a few years there. Maybe walk me through what happened next, and how did you start Oakura? But maybe start why you made that shift in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So obviously this was a very difficult decision for me, because not only I like Teralytics, but as well, obviously the founders very much, and as well all the people that we kind of were able to convince to join that cause. So it was a difficult decision for me to do a next step. But it was as well, after almost 3 years, it was felt as well natural to the extent that I felt now. I had someone, or I kind of assembled as well a team that was able to take care of the operational parts that I was responsible for, and finance. But I realized as well that my passion as well, or my interest for the operational aspects of a company was rather driven by understanding and learning these new aspects. But once you kind of hire someone from a third country, or once you set up, I don't know, from employee incentive plans to all these different sources, like it becomes as well repetitive to some sort. And I think for me, what fascinates me most about just life as well in general, I think, is the interactions with humans, is the ability to turn things into new things, or ideas into reality. So for me, it was a step that I felt it was time, and as well because on one hand I thought, why not a new challenge with learning to fly, so something completely different. So when I left Teralytics, it was with the intent to learn to do a private pilot license, and to think of how could I, after these insights that I've gained from being involved in the US, but as well in Switzerland, in different startups, different positions, very different industries, and I think it kind of dawned on me the more I spent time on thinking, like, why is the failure rate of startups so high? Why do 9 out of 10 startups fail? Or why do premature exits even exist? Why do founders get squeezed out or forced to kind of sell their companies before it's the right time? So the more I spent time on this, the more I realized how many things in the startup ecosystem and the venture business is kind of not optimally aligned. But I was always also, when I left Teralytics, I founded a company together with 2 other partners that with the idea to there's a small venture company where we wanted to invest in startups at a very early stage and help them with operational support. But when I came back from flying, so I did the private pilot license, came back and started to spend more time on building that company. We incorporated, I think, pretty soon after I left Teralytics. But the more I spent time on thinking on how we could actually then be more efficient and helping more founders, the more I realized as well, there is just such a natural limit to all these venture business models that I've come across until then on how you could help more founders to succeed. And maybe a very quick excursion, I think, as Walt Disney, I think, at some point put it, where he said, we don't make movies to make more money, we make more money to make more movies. Wow. And I think in that very, very essence, for me as well, I didn't want to just do a venture company to make money, but I would want to do a venture company to support more startups, to help more founders, to help more companies to become successful. With that, I realized as well the limitations of such a more traditional model where you invest in startups, help them a little bit, and then sell these stakes at a higher valuation at a later point, or some of that in that portfolio. And then getting more involved as well with the crypto space, I realized as well, there's a lot of stuff going on as well with tokenization of venture funds and so on. And the more I was digging in deeper and the more I talked to as well close friends of mine that I always thought would be great to start a company with, I realized, this actually could be something much more significant than just like a little bit of something, same, but a little bit different, but rather something that really could have an impact on a much larger scale by basically including some of the ideas and concepts from the crypto and blockchain world into the traditional venture industry. And so obviously another very difficult decision was then with the partners I was then with that company that I founded right after Teralytics, was that I realized as well, because I was the only one working full-time on that and the others were still employed in their other jobs, I felt like 1 week of me was like already a big distance to them because they didn't have enough time to devote to that as well. Very new topics of this crypto and tokenized venture fund idea. And so the very difficult decision was then to eventually not continue that venture, but with new individuals and friends of mine that I shared this kind of, I would almost say like newer form of a venture model. The more I realized that everyone that I convinced to join this new endeavor, I owe them the best possible setup and structure to possibly make it a success. And that's where I then had the difficult decision to continue, to discontinue with the previous founders, but then assemble this new team with Oakura. And so that was then how I came to found then Oakura, which we incorporated beginning of last year.
And maybe just to quickly interrupt, you said it was a really difficult decision for you to kind of stop that venture. Were there any tips or what was your thought process there? Like, I assume it's not something you decided from one day to the other. Were there any tools or other measures you used to make that decision? Do you have any advice there for someone who might be in a similar decision, if they should continue something they already started, or if they should just stop and start something else?
A good question. I think I think what I always like to kind of do if I see something is kind of not in line or something seems not optimal, then I wonder like, okay, so if I mentally change something and say like, okay, so what if it was different? And then I look at the picture and think like, okay, would this be better? Would this kind of be a relief? And I think what I like to do, and what maybe for others could help too, is just think on in these different scenarios. Going them through, sometimes I just need to go running for 2 hours And then I can much more clearly think of these different options, and I can as well touch base with myself and realize like, okay, so is this a structure that, or a combination that would make sense? And if something, then if I gravitate towards like one or a certain group of scenarios, then I realize, okay, so this is probably like, would be a much more meaningful way to do. But I think at the end is another idea or another way to look at it could as well be much more like an essentialist view on something where every one of us has like we own things, and our homes or apartments are cluttered with things that we might not even need. And rather to look at something and say like, do I want to get rid of this, and what would I want in return? We should rather think of, so if I didn't own this, if I didn't already possess this, what would I be willing to give for it? And I think just this slightly different perspective could help and realize that just because something is now in a certain way and we accept that it's here, doesn't mean that we should actually just continue. So I don't know whether there's a comparison that makes sense, but I think, or is understandable, but I think not accepting the status quo just because it's convenient or it seems more natural, and rather wondering like, okay, is this really a best setup? Is this really how, if I could step back and watch again the comparison with the chessboard, if I could step out and then just observe the two players, is this what I think would make most sense? Or do I just move here because I feel like, I'm kind of cornered, or I need to do this because I already started? So I think we humans have so many biases. And I think one of these biases is as well that it's the sunk cost, right? You already started something, you sit in a movie and you have already paid the ticket and you think, this is a horrible movie, I don't enjoy it. But you should rather step out and then say like, let's make use of the remaining hour that I have of my life than just continue with that just because it paid already the ticket. So I think these are kind of the mental concepts that I like to toss around in my head to really kind of figure out what are best decisions to continue sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's very valuable advice, especially the sunk cost fallacy. I mean, I think we all always fall into that trap, and even though, I think that the movie is a great example. The same thing for me with books. Even if it's a terrible book that I don't like, I still make myself finish it and kind of suffer through the last few hundred pages, even though I think I would be better off not spending my time there anymore. Yeah. So definitely valuable advice. So I think now you're at this point where you made that hard decision and you kind of pivoted to this new business that you wanted to start, which is now Oakura. Am I right? Okay. You talked about assembling the team. How did you go about that? Because I think hiring is or not even hiring in that stage, I think just getting the right people to start a new venture with is probably the number one most important decision you can make. So in my opinion, so how did you go about that?
So I think it's a mix between like, obviously kind of what is kind of your dream team, or the individuals that you might already know and might have thought of already, but then how realistic is it to have them included? I mean, in terms of do they have enough time? Are they close enough? Are they committed enough? And so I think the combination of the, if you would say, kind of the availability and the ability is kind of something to juggle as well, that for me was important. Even with Oakura, we had a few iterations, or I experienced a few iterations, because those that were the very beginning involved are not, we are, how can I say, like, in order to get to the team now, there was just as well were iterations that we underwent with all individuals that I think would have been great to even still be part of it as close as the core founding team. But on the other hand as well, it's just not always realistic that individuals that might not be close enough locationally, or that are not available at this moment to that extent. So I think as well with the team, it's just it's a mix of finding what is driving them as well, because the driving motivation should as well be like kind of the longer term change that we can make than rather like a shorter term gain. None of them that were in this kind of closer or outer group of the initial team was short-term oriented. So that was already obviously one of the big reasons to assemble them. But then I think to the actual core team that we are now, this just underwent as well iterations itself. But I think it's very important then just to start with in one way and then just see what happens later. I think for that very reason, it's as well important to have, whenever you start and we have a core team, that you agree on a certain vesting period, because you never know what happens to individuals. They might have personal changes that come into place. They might need to move to another location because of their partners and so on, or they might not be moved back. And so I think long story short, I think it's the flexibility that you need to have even in this early stage of assembling team. But
so you would say flexibility and that everyone can commit 100% to is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, I think you also said some of the founders or co-founders of Oakura, they are your personal friends as well. How do you view that? Because I think some people, they would try to avoid starting a company with personal friends. They try to strictly distinguish between kind of the business part and the friendship part. How do you view that? Because there's also the other view that I think you trust each other already, which is a big factor. And that can also be a very beneficial factor in making the business work.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I think it's a very blurry line. I don't think it's binary. I don't think it's either one or the other. I think it's much more blurry. And if you start working with someone, or at least what I've experienced as well, or what maybe is more like the way I function, is that I think it's always easier and you get actually more stuff done if you understand each other better. And that very often implies as well that there is some sort of friendship or kind of connection that you start to share. So even if you maybe start with someone that you purely view on a business transactional side, I would argue that if you're capable of forming healthy relationships, it's more natural that you anyway as well befriend each other. So I think in that sense, it becomes maybe more a question, would you want to start with someone that you were already friends with? Or would you accept that someone you're not friends with at the beginning, that you start as well a friendship over the course of time? So I think unless we would really much more like try to separate and really not be friends. And I think if you view the people you work with as humans, then rather like just a workforce, I would argue that more naturally there is some sort of friendship that starts as well. I wouldn't want to work with people I would not want to be as well friends with. But I think to the other topic, I think that you indirectly brought up, I think it's very important to still distinguish between like the business activity that you need, or the goals and the targets you want to reach, and then how you treat the human. Because just because you're friends doesn't mean that you should accept that a certain goal is not achieved, or that people are not doing what they're supposed to do. And I think it's a very important distinction, that just because you're friends with someone, if you share a goal, if you have a goal to go somewhere, then let's say you want to sail somewhere, and the other person is trying to steer and looks at the map and is supposed to be able to know where to go. If they drive to a wrong course, then even if it's your friend, it's not okay to just say, oh, it's okay. No, it's not okay. This is bad. I think you have to still be able to kind of go ahead and fight. So be almost tough on the cause, but soft on the person. I forgot, it's someone else, I think, said it. I know it's a quote, but yeah. But I think at the very essence, this is, I think, what should be how I view it and how I think. So being soft means you can be friends, but if you share a common goal, you have to be as well. You have to give each other a very hard time, because otherwise you're never going to get there.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think it's difficult, but these conversations are necessary, definitely in a startup context where I think some wrong decision could really be the end of the company as well, or it has a very big impact on a company, and there you really need to be on the same page. So I think now it would be a good time to start talking about Oakura. We mentioned the name several times before. I also heard from a lot of people they don't really know what it means actually. So first of all, what does Oakura mean, and then what is it exactly? What is the company?
Okay, yeah, of course. So people might think it sounds Japanese, but it's a word play between two words. On one hand, oak tree ecosystem provider. So many different species are basically part of oak trees, and it's a huge ecosystem provider. But it's of course as well a great building material. You can build ships and you can sail to different continents. But so the oak as kind of an ecosystem provider, a building material, combined with cura, which is the old Roman goddess where the word care and cure comes from, is the word combination that at the essence very much describes as well what we do, that we bring like an ecosystem, startup and venture ecosystem, but change it to the extent that, or I wouldn't say cure, but change it for the better for the participants. And so that is the combination of Oakura. There is as well, I think in New Zealand, a surfer spot that I think is a small fishing village, but that's where the name eventually came from, of this word combination.
Okay, great. That makes a lot of sense. And now, what is Oakura? I know it draws from what is possible with blockchain and crypto, but maybe in your own words, what is the goal of Oakura? Because I think you're trying to set the better incentives for startup success and the whole VC discussion we had before. Maybe you could give a quick introduction into what is Oakura.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we want to do with Oakura is we want to make more entrepreneurs successful. We want to make entrepreneurs succeed faster and more often. As mentioned earlier, at the moment you have 9 out of 10 startups that fail. You have 95% of venture funds are not really returning or enough money for the huge amount of time that they keep the money locked. So what we really at the essence want to do, we are building a system where we want to make more founders more successful. Now, obviously, there are probably many questions in terms of how can we do it and why. But from industry data, 25, maybe soon almost 30 years of venturing data, it's as well much better understood that there is not really a winner's picking. The ability of choosing which startup is going to be very successful is a very, very difficult. It's very difficult. So obviously the workaround is to just have a portfolio and possibly have a larger portfolio, to more likely have one outlier in it that might be able to return the other losses you have. But it's as well understood that if you have typically, even at this early stage, angels that are willing to step in and help much more operationally, much more thoroughly that startup to complement the skills and the network that they don't have, that these additional hands-on support can lead to a much higher success rate as well of these ventures. It seems kind of obvious, but the problem is with in the current venture industry, there is not a system where you can help these founders at a larger scale. You have as a fund, as an angel, as any kind of startup supporter, you have very limited capacities. And then how could you do that? How could you help startups much more hands-on, but as well at scale? And at the end, this is exactly what we do with Oakura, because instead of just us providing money and then helping with our very limited capacity and limited expertise, a particular startup, we basically incentivize an entire network of experts, advisors, and mentors to do that, but not do it just for free and not do it just for fiat money, which these startups anyway don't have, or not enough at this early stage. We enable them to earn a stake of that entire venture portfolio that we have. So it's almost like from a traditional fund that has limited partners, the investors of a fund, we move to a system that from limited partners, we move to unlimited partnerships. So, because eventually every expert that we have as part of that community every expert that helps a startup with a specific challenge or problem, they can earn that stake through that work that they provide.
So to summarize, you have an ecosystem of different startups that you select, and then also of service providers that are part of this whole ecosystem. And they help each other out by trading a token that represents this portfolio of startups of that ecosystem. So that's kind of the currency for the services within that ecosystem. Is that a correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Summarization?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's if another way to describe what we do is as well advice for equity. So we build a network of experts that really can be like individuals that have experience in specific industries or access to particular networks or have built companies, sold companies, or know how to solve specific operational aspects of a company, or individuals that have cutting edge knowledge in a specific technology. And we allow them basically to earn a stake in exchange for the work they provide. And that can be either a stake from that entire portfolio if we've invested in that startup, or it can as well be a startup that is that we deem interesting enough to be part of that network, and a startup that has tokenized their own equity and is able to exchange its own equity for advice from a specific advisor. But it's important to see that network as an enabler for these startups to find the right resource.
Okay, so you are now building this company for how long? Or at what stage are you at right now?
So we incorporated beginning of last year, and have we received a small grant from ETH, ETHJ fund. Realized in summer last year that it is much easier to get very high profile experts as well into that network, because many of them already they help startups, or they have knowledge that they do not capitalize on. They don't get anything in return. And so suddenly with our system, they actually can get something back. We thought before we just build an entire platform, we rather try out whether we can find not only these interesting experts, but as well interesting startups to then actually do such an investment and see how that exchange is going to happen. So we did that. It's kind of a proof of concept that we did, and were able to successfully close that end of last year. So we realized, okay, what we did now much more, hands-on and manual, that we need to be able to do that on a platform. So at the very moment, we are testing our alpha version of that platform, and we have about 150 experts, from chairmen of large Swiss corporations over to entrepreneurs that have built and sold companies, to high-level experts in very specific fields, from big data, AI, AR, VR. So it's already a very interesting mix of individuals that, unless you already have a huge network, you don't just easily get across these. And even if you have that network, you probably don't know who actually has what knowledge or specialized really in something or could help you with something. So by now already we have a database where you can basically search, and that's what the alpha version facilitates even more, because everyone that applies and gets an approval from our side, because we really check each individual, it allows us really to keep that quality of these advisors as well quite high. And so that is kind of at the very moment the stage we're in. We have a project as well with InnoSwiss, the former KTI, Bund, Swiss governmental supported initiative, where we work with the University of Zurich Blockchain Center, and are in preparation of building a consortia that we have assembled now, a few key players, not only from university or academia side, but as well from industry, some players that we think will be able to contribute even more to the larger plan of building this platform.
So are you also already looking at startups that will be part of it? Or is this then the next stage? Let's say once you are more like live operationally as well, that you then think about adding startups to the ecosystem and then tokenizing part of their equity?
No, already now. Yeah.
Already
so
now.
that means, yeah. So that means if there are interesting or interested founders We are already now including them, and we can not only tokenize directly, but as well we can provide them with these share portfolio that obviously at the moment this is just growing, so it's like still at its earlier stage, but it allows us already now to help them connect. Because we have stakes in them, we are not imposing any other restrictions. So the platform they get access to is really only to help them find the right partner. It might be that they get investment from one or acquire a high-profile advisor through that platform. But it's really up to these participants then. So we don't impose any other restrictions. The platform is really just an enabler for these startups to find relevant answers to questions faster.
Okay, I think it sounds very interesting, and I would encourage everyone to have a look at it if you are interested to learn more or maybe become part of the economy. Mm-hmm. So I think personally it's a very cool project, a very different approach to this new type of VC model almost. So best of luck to you there.
Thanks.
And so maybe this is a time to shift gears a little bit. I wanted to also talk to you about maybe more personal and more rapid fire questions. Mm-hmm. So I'm, as a podcast host, I'm very interested in learning more a bit about the person behind all these companies as well, and kind of what makes you tick. And since I like reading a lot, do you have any books that you would recommend aspiring founders, or it can be anyone that you think are meaningful to you, or that you would recommend other people reading?
A good question. I have many. I'm a notorious book starter, but a very bad finisher. One book that I finished and that I really liked a few years back is The Power of Habit from Charles Duhigg. So I think this is really one as well that I thought was very, very eye-opening in many aspects, just to understand better of what makes human do certain things. I think that there's maybe a larger list of different books that I find interesting for different aspects. But I think what I'm often as well interested is in books that look at why are people doing why are they doing what they do? What creates drive? And a book that I haven't finished yet, but is a new book of Robert Greene, the one that wrote the 48 Laws of Power, that I think is as well kind of is amusing to read, particularly for those that follow politics or are interested as well in this more I would say almost Machiavellian House of Cards and other kind of series. Not to exploit power, but I think to understand the patterns better, because we humans are humans can be manipulated, and it just has been shown in history. There are so many organizations, companies that do that, and I think for that it's a very good way to understand as well better what makes humans do something. And the newest book of Robert Greene is Understanding Human Nature or something. That I've thought was kind of interesting, but I haven't finished yet. But I haven't put it away yet. So, but
cool. Yeah, I'm going to look all of these books up, and I'll add them to the notes of the podcast so people can have a look at it. Maybe something else. I think you mentioned before a few times boat or sailing, etc. Would I be wrong to assume that you have some type of interest in activities in this area?
Yes and no. So I'm not sailing myself. I don't have a sailing license.
Okay.
It's on my list that before I went to do my private pilot license, I thought, okay, the next thing I want to do is either sailing or learning how to fly. And then I picked flying because I thought I can do the sailing as well later.
Okay.
But I have very much interest more as well from a historical point of view, because I think obviously history is an entire other part that I'm just completely fascinated with, because there's a wealth of information not only about us humans, but as well about societies, about all these learnings. Yeah, so that means I've sailed a couple of times on friends' boats and activities, and I like it. But I'm not a sailor myself.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's as well something that I think would be super, super fun to learn.
Okay. I think where I wanted to go with that question is like, if you have any hobby that others would perceive as weird or unusual. because that's the question I like to ask people, because I think it's always interesting to hear the answer to that.
I think that really depends on the person. I think for me, it's what I realize is that what sometimes surprises people is that I get bored very fast, and that means I look for new challenges that I can do. So I think I started so many different as well sports, from paragliding to skydiving, over to kayaking, to all different sorts of things. What I ended up really liking and then more regularly do is, when I have time and abilities, either row on the lake, so as a more like workout thing, or then when I'm if I have the possibilities in other places to dive, I really like wreck diving. I think that is a super fascinating thing. After you've seen like all the different corals and most of the sea animals, you kind of, or I at least, feel like, it's kind of always the same. But what is really new is like if you happen to have a spot where you can dive around a sunken ship. So maybe there a sailing aspect comes into play. What I really like as well is I like to think. I kind of like these thought experiments sometimes, to think of. So if we were now 50 years from now and would look back, what would we maybe tell ourselves that we could have done differently or faster? And I think, not to go too far down that road, but I think it's really interesting to think as well, what are things that we do now that we really won't be able to accept at a later point? And history has shown that, whether it's like slavery, that obviously like how it's impossible for us to understand how it even has been like that. But more recently in history, women's voting rights. How could this not have been already from the first place? Why did it take humans so long? And these concepts, I think, are very interesting, because when you think of vegetarianism, I'm not a vegetarian. I like to eat meat. But if I think ahead, I think there will be a time humans will look back and feel like, what the F? How could this have been? And I think there are many more of these, and these kind of, I think, sometimes very interesting, because it gives insights, I think, for us humans, how to improve not only us as an individual, but as well as a society better. And obviously I would want to increase the speed of that.
Yeah, these are indeed very, very interesting. And I think I'm also not a vegetarian myself, but some very influential people in Silicon Valley and other areas, and I think also like Yuval Noah Harari, the author of *Sapiens*. I think he said even we will look back.
Great book as well.
Yeah, great book. Yeah. I can recommend it to anyone. I think he said we will look back at this century and it will go down as like the greatest mass genocide of animals or something like that. And I think it's just because of. So I think there is also a trend that will go in that direction. Yeah, that's something we will look back on and not really understand how this was possible. Yes. And there's a lot of these examples, I think. So I like that answer. And so I think we're coming towards the end, but maybe one more question. And it goes in a similar direction. If you could look back or give an advice to your younger self or anyone else that is now, let's say, early 20s, maybe studying or about to graduate, would you have some specific advice to them? Or if it's yourself, would you have any advice to your younger self?
Yeah, I think I would have a ton of advice for myself. I don't think, maybe for others it's different, but I think at the essence it's just like, whenever you think you could do something or you have an idea, I think just trying it out, just doing. I think not shying away from just as well doing mistakes. I think as an engineer, or by education, we are, I think, much more trained on really doing something. You cannot build a bridge by doing it 80%. So that just doesn't work, because it's too risky, it's too dangerous. But I think with many other things in life, you rather just try to do something, even if it's not perfect or if you're not fully ready yet, just because this increases the cycle of learnings. And I think that it eventually will be what I think as well, whether it's in terms of hobbies that you think, or whether it's like work-related stuff, on jobs you do. I think rather just try something out. If it doesn't work, or if you don't like it too much, quit and do something next. I think the very same principle as with the product market fit in entrepreneurship on finding and adjusting that product idea to the market and looping back should be applied. And I would, I think, give myself that and say, like, think of it the very same way. Just try out things. If it doesn't work out, adjust, learn, include that in your learnings, and then it will get you to a very exciting place.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Are there any last thoughts from your side that you wanted to mention or that you want people to hear? Any last words?
Well, I think I really want to plant again the idea and the challenge of why do we accept that so many startups fail? Mm-hmm. Because before penicillin was invented, it was obviously normal that people would die, that after the mass production as well of penicillin, obviously you can't save people. So the mortality rate dropped. And I think now we just accept that the majority of startups fail. And I think, why accept that? And I think if there is a way to do it, it would have so many benefits to the entire society. More jobs, more products, more returns even for investors. But at the end as well, more GDP for a country and the increase of wealth for society. So I think it's just not acceptable that so many startups fail.
Okay, thank you very much. So, and where can people find more about Oakura? Maybe you can quickly mention the website and where people can find out more about you as well if they're interested.
Yeah, absolutely. So the best is to go on oakura.io. Either read through or join us as well on making that happen and become part of what we call the economy. And if you want to get in touch with me, the best is probably just via LinkedIn. I'm sure you maybe can provide the link at the end of the...
Yes, happy to do that. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Daniel, then for this first episode of the Leap Takers podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm honored.
Well, I'm glad you could make this happen, and hopefully this is the start to a great adventure for myself and also for you with economy.
Thanks. Wishing you much success with that.
Thank you.
All right, guys, this was the first episode of the Leap Takers podcast. Thank you very much for listening. It would mean the world to me if you would head over to the iTunes store and search for the Leap Takers podcast with Remo Keyboards and give this show a 5-star review. This will help the show to get recommended to more people, and then consequently I can also get better guests for this show. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram, and I'm also very happy to hear about any suggestions, questions, or other feedback that you have for this show. Just drop me a message. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you will enjoy the upcoming episodes as well. Bye-bye.